Germany took over 1,900 years to become one country, but less than 12 years for one man to nearly burn it all down. Adolf Hitler ruled the Third Reich for just over a decade. In that time, his war killed more than 70 million people worldwide. But before the swastika, there were dukes, hundreds of them, warring, marrying, scheming for 1,000 years just to build the empire he'd later destroy. And after he fell, a shattered nation, split in two, walled apart for 45 years, before rising again as one of the most powerful economies on Earth. This is the full story of Germany, from tribal warlords to the Third Reich to the country it is today. For most of its history, Germany did not exist. Not as a single nation, not as one people under one flag. For nearly 1,000 years, the land at the heart of Europe was a patchwork of hundreds of kingdoms, dukedoms, bishoprics, and free cities, loosely bound together under something called the Holy Roman Empire. An empire that, as the old joke goes, was neither holy nor Roman nor really an empire at all. A traveler crossing from one German town to the next might cross a dozen borders, pay a dozen tolls, and answer to a dozen different rulers, all speaking some version of German, none of them united. That began to change in the 1800s. One man, more than any other, forced the German-speaking peoples into a single country. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Prussia. He did not unite Germany through idealism or democratic votes. He did it through what he openly called blood and iron, a calculated string of wars. First against Denmark in 1864, then against Austria in 1866, a war that pushed the old Austrian-led German world aside and put Prussia firmly in charge. And finally, in 1870, against France, a swift, humiliating defeat for the French that filled Germans with a surge of national pride. In January of 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the very heart of French power, the German Empire was proclaimed. Germany was, for the first time in history, one nation. What followed was staggering. In just a few decades, Germany transformed from a collection of farming states into an industrial giant. Steel mills, railways, chemical plants, universities that led the world in physics and chemistry. By the early 1900s, German factories were outproducing Britain's. German science was winning Nobel Prizes. And with that new wealth came new ambition. Colonies in Africa, a growing navy, and a hunger to be recognized as a great power equal to Britain and France. That ambition helped drag the world into catastrophe. In the summer of 1914, the assassination of an Austrian archduke set off a tangled web of alliances, rivalries, and military planning that no one seemed able to stop. Germany marched to war alongside Austria-Hungary, and within weeks, most of Europe was fighting. The First World War dragged on for 4 years, turning the fields of France into a landscape of trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns. Millions of young men on all sides died for a few miles of mud. By 1918, Germany was starving, exhausted, and defeated. The Kaiser abdicated. A new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, was left to sign the peace and to hold together a broken, humiliated nation. It didn't hold. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of territory, slashed its military down to almost nothing, and forced it to pay enormous reparations to the countries it had fought. Many Germans never accepted the terms, and a bitter myth took hold that the army hadn't really lost the war, but had been stabbed in the back by politicians at home. Then came economic collapse. In 1923, hyperinflation spiraled so far out of control that people famously pushed wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. The currency became almost worthless overnight. The economy briefly stabilized, only to be crushed again by the Great Depression at the end of the decade. Unemployment soared past 6 million. Into that despair stepped a failed painter and decorated war veteran named Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialist Party, promising order, national pride, and revenge against the nations he blamed for Germany's humiliation. In January 1933, Hitler became chancellor. Within weeks, a fire gutted the German parliament building, and the Nazis used it as an excuse to suspend civil liberties. By the summer, opposition parties were banned, and Hitler held absolute power. Democracy in Germany was dead. What came next is one of the darkest chapters in human history. The Nazi regime built a totalitarian state on propaganda, surveillance, and fear. It began stripping Jewish citizens of their rights, their businesses, their citizenship, culminating in nights of state-organized violence like Kristallnacht in 1938, when synagogues burned across the country. Germany rearmed in secret, then openly, tearing up the Versailles restrictions one by one while the rest of Europe watched and hesitated. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. The war that followed killed tens of millions of people worldwide. German forces swept across Europe with terrifying speed. France fell in 6 weeks in 1940. Britain held on alone. In 1941, Hitler made the fateful decision to invade the Soviet Union, opening a brutal Eastern Front that would eventually consume the German army. And under the cover of this war, the Nazi regime carried out the Holocaust, the systematic, industrialized murder of 6 million Jews, along with Roma people, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and others the regime deemed unworthy of life. It remains one of the greatest crimes ever committed by a state against humanity. By 1945, the tide had turned completely. Allied forces landed in Normandy in the west, while Soviet troops fought their way toward Berlin from the east. In April 1945, with Soviet soldiers just blocks from his bunker, Hitler took his own life. Days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Its cities lay in rubble. Dresden, Cologne, Berlin, reduced to ash and broken stone. An estimated 8 million Germans were dead. The nation that had set out to conquer Europe had instead destroyed itself. The victorious Allies, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, carved the defeated country into occupation zones. Within a few years, as the Cold War hardened, those zones split into 2 separate countries. West Germany, rebuilt as a democracy allied with the United States and Western Europe, and East Germany, a communist state under Soviet control. Berlin itself, sitting deep inside the East, was divided in the same way. In 1961, the East German government built a concrete wall straight through the city to stop its own citizens from fleeing to the West. For nearly 3 decades, that wall stood as the most visible scar of the Cold War. Families separated, a nation split down the middle, guards under orders to shoot anyone who tried to cross. Then, in the autumn of 1989, it fell. A wave of protests swept across Eastern Europe, and on the night of November 9th, confused East German border guards, overwhelmed by crowds, simply opened the checkpoints. Ordinary Germans climbed onto the wall itself and began tearing it apart with hammers in their bare hands, live on television for the entire world to watch. Within less than a year, on October 3rd, 1990, East and West Germany were formally reunified into a single country once again. The Germany that emerged from reunification worked to rebuild itself, but on entirely different foundations than before. As a stable democracy, anchored deep inside the European Union and NATO, deliberately committed to never repeating the horrors of its past. Reunification was not easy or cheap. Trillions of dollars were poured into modernizing the crumbling infrastructure and economy of the former East, and the gap between East and West is still felt today. But by the 2000s, Germany had become the economic engine of Europe, the continent's largest economy, a global leader in automobiles, engineering, and manufacturing, and under long-serving leaders like Angela Merkel, one of the steadiest, most trusted democracies in the world. The story hasn't stood still, though. Germany today faces real strain. The energy crisis triggered by Russia's war in Ukraine hit German industry hard, exposing just how dependent the country had quietly become on cheap Russian gas. Debates over immigration have grown sharper and more divisive, and a far-right party has gained real ground in German politics for the first time since the war. A development many Germans view with deep unease, given everything their history has taught them about where that road can lead. Under its current chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who took office in 2025, Germany has pledged to sharply raise its defense spending and take on a much larger military role in Europe. A striking shift for a country that spent 80 years deliberately keeping its army small and its ambitions modest. Germany's story isn't just about one country. It's a warning and a lesson wrapped into one.